May 24, 1944, Liri Valley, Italy, 0412 hours. A darkness so dense it seems to possess physical weight pressing against the chest, like the wet earth lining the slit trench itself. The air does not just smell of rain and mud, but carries that unmistakable metallic tang of old cordite, mixed with the sickly sweet stench of wet decomposition that the Italian spring mist never quite washes away. Sergeant William James Mitchell, 23rd Field Regiment of the Royal Canadian Artillery, 32 years old, is not sleeping. He never really sleeps before a barrage. His hands, calloused from a decade of labor in the Hamilton steel mills before the war, and now permanently stained with axle grease and gun oil, tremble slightly, not from cold though the temperature has dropped to 46 degrees Fahrenheit, but from that specific electric vibration that precedes the end of the world. He is crouching beside the cold steel breech of his 17-pounder, running a dirty cotton rag over the firing mechanism for the 1000th time, his eyes, red-rimmed from exhaustion and stung by cheap tobacco smoke, fixed on nothing, on the impenetrable gloom where he knows with the absolute certainty of a man who has seen the devil that they are waiting. Up to this moment, William and his crew had already fired over 3,400 high-explosive and conventional armor-piercing rounds since landing in Sicily, statistics that in any other context would be mere numbers in a quartermaster's ledger, but here represent 3,400 moments of concussive violence that rattled their teeth and rewrote the topography of their eardrums, leaving a sharp, constant tinnitus that never leaves, a Hertzian reminder that silence is only a temporary lie. They had smashed pillboxes, machine gun nests, and soft-skinned vehicles, learned to calculate the parabolic trajectory of death with the indifference of an accountant tallying expenses, watched men turned into red mist by shrapnel less than 50 yards away, and continued eating their cold rations of bully beef minutes later, because horror, when repeated enough, becomes as banal as the rain. But now something different, something that sits in the stomach like a stone swallowed whole. In exactly 2 hours and 48 minutes, as the first grey light of dawn begins to bleed over the jagged silhouette of the Abbey of Monte Cassino to their rear, they are going to attempt something that physics books and German tactical manuals say is impossible, something that will break a record written in blood and steel. The enemy across the valley does not know they are there, does not know that the rules of engagement they have relied upon for 3 years are about to be rewritten by a projectile the size of a milk bottle. The Germans believe they are safe at this range, safe behind 100 millimeters of face-hardened Krupp steel, safe in the arrogant certainty that no Allied gun can touch them from 800 yards without shattering against their hull like glass thrown at a vault door. They expect the usual, the futile bounce of solid shot, the desperate maneuvering of Shermans trying to flank, the predictable rhythm of an inferior force breaking against superior engineering. They had something much more dangerous than a new tank or a bigger gun. They had a small dense dart of tungsten carbide wrapped in a discarding sabot that defied the known ballistics of the European theatre. To understand why this specific morning in the Liri Valley represented such a seismic psychological shock to the Panzer-Lehr doctrine, you have to go back to the beginning, back before the mud of Italy, to the terrified reverence with which the Allies viewed the Tiger tank. The German doctrine of the Tiger was not merely tactical, it was philosophical, rooted in the concept of the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point, but elevated to a mythological status where engineering superiority was expected to compensate for numerical inferiority. Developed by heavy industry titans like Henschel and Porsche, the Tiger I was built on 4 central assumptions that had held true since 1942. That engagement ranges would be dictated by their optics, that their armor was impervious to standard Allied anti-tank fire, effectively rendering them mobile fortresses, that the psychological impact of their presence was a weapon as potent as their 88mm KWK-36 gun, and that the Allies would always be forced to close the distance to engage, entering the killing zone on German terms. It was a rational doctrine, validated in the slaughter of Tunisia and the steppes of Kursk, where Tigers sat comfortably at 2,000 meters, picking off T-34s and Shermans like shooters at a carnival range. They trusted in the numbers with a religious fervor. 100 millimeters of frontal armor, 80 millimeters of side armor, a gun that could penetrate the frontal plate of a Sherman at 2,000 yards, while the Sherman's 75mm rounds bounced off the Tiger's front at point-blank range. They had the reports, the after-action assessments from encounters where single Tigers, halted entire armored divisions, absorbing dozens of hits with nothing but scratched paint to show for it, creating a sense of invincibility that permeated every level of the crew's psyche. This wasn't ignorance, it was empirical arrogance. German intelligence knew the caliber of Allied guns. They knew the muzzle velocities. They knew the composition of standard armor-piercing shot. They knew that mathematically, kinetically, the Allies did not possess the energy required to punch through the frontal arc of a tiger beyond suicidal ranges. What they failed to grasp, what they could not internalize until the moment William James Mitchell pulled the lanyard, was that the Allies had stopped trying to match them tank for tank and had instead turned to pure physics, sacrificing explosive payload for velocity, trading the sledgehammer for the needle. They had prepared for a boxing match against a heavyweight, while the Allies were forging a shiv to slip between the ribs. It is a tragedy of logistics that the Germans poured millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of man-hours into thickening steel plates that would soon be rendered obsolete by a simple change in ammunition design, a waste of resources that borders on the comical, if not for the mounds of corpses it produced. But before the tungsten hit the steel, there was the man. William James Mitchell was born on November 12, 1912 in Hamilton, Ontario, a city of smokestacks and blast furnaces that forged the spine of Canada. He was the son of a shift foreman at the Steel Company of Canada and a seamstress who went blind from cataracts before the war began. He grew up in the shadow of the mills, inhaling coal dust and sulfur, learning early that steel was not just a material but a living thing that could be tempered, hardened, and if treated without respect, could kill you in a heartbeat. He had wanted to be an architect. He had a sketchbook full of charcoal drawings of cathedrals and libraries, delicate lines that betrayed a sensitivity his rough hands tried to hide, but the depression killed that dream as surely as a bullet, forcing him into the heat of the rolling mills where he watched molten metal snake through the rollers like angry orange pythons. He enlisted on September 4, 1939, 4 days after Hitler marched into Poland, not out of a sense of adventure, but because he saw the same look in his father's eyes that he saw in the newsreels, a weary recognition that the world was breaking again. His training was a blur of muddy fields in England, endless drills on the 25-pounder, learning the trigonometry of indirect fire, the art of laying a gun under duress, the way the cold seeps into your bones on the Salisbury Plain until you forget what warmth feels like. But it was his transfer to the anti-tank specialized units that changed him, selected for his aptitude with mental math and his calm under pressure, traits honed by years of dodging swinging ladles of liquid steel. He remembered his first instructor, a scarred veteran of Dunkirk named Sergeant Major Sterling, who told them on the first day that their job was not to survive, but to trade their lives for time, to stand in the path of a 60-ton monster and spit in its eye until it ran them over. William's first experience under fire was in Sicily, a confused skirmish in an olive grove, where he watched his loader, a kid named Dougie from Saskatchewan, lose his head to a 20mm cannon shell, the body standing for a horrifying second before collapsing like a puppet with cut strings. That was the moment the architect in him died, replaced by the gunner who understood that geometry was the only god that mattered in war, that angles and velocity were the arbiters of who lived and who died. He became proficient, then expert, learning to read the terrain, to hide a 2-ton gun in a patch of scrub brush so effectively that you could walk past it at 10 paces and not see the muzzle. But the guilt never left him, the specific, gnawing moral dilemma of being a killer who looked through a sight and saw not a machine, but the men inside it. He remembered a night in Ortona, sheltering in a bombed-out cellar with his corporal, a man named Elias, arguing over a bottle of looted wine about the soul. Elias argued that firing at a tank was clean, impersonal, metal on metal, but William knew better. He knew that when the shell penetrated, what happened inside that steel box was a nightmare of spalling metal and flash fires that cooked men alive in their seats. He rationalized it by thinking of the infantry, the boys from the Loyalist Edmontons and the Seaforths who relied on his gun to keep the panzers off their backs. He told himself that every tank he burned was 100 mothers in Canada who wouldn't receive a telegram, but late at night when the guns fell silent, he could still smell the burning meat. For decades after the war, he would wake up sweating, hands grasping for a traverse wheel that wasn't there, haunted by the paradox of his existence, a builder of imaginary cathedrals forced to become a demolitionist of human beings. The weapon that brought these two forces together, The German armor and the Canadian gunner was officially designated the Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-pounder, but to the men who hauled its 3 tons through the mud of Italy, it was simply the Pheasant, a code name that belied its lethality. For the engineers back in Britain, it was a marvel of ballistics, a 55 caliber barrel capable of withstanding pressures of over 20 tons per square inch. The projectile that would make history that morning was the armor-piercing discarding sabot, or APDS. The specs were visceral, terrifying in their implications. The core was a sub-caliber dart of tungsten carbide, barely 1.5 inches in diameter, encased in a light alloy sabot or pot that gripped the rifling of the barrel. When fired, the assembly left the muzzle at a staggering 3,950 feet per second, nearly 4 times the speed of sound, faster than any tank gun projectile in existence at the time. The moment it exited the barrel, the air resistance stripped away the outer sabot, leaving the heavy, dense dart to fly alone, retaining its velocity over distances that made standard shot drop like a stone. It was like throwing a needle at Mach 4. When this dart struck face-hardened armor, it didn't smash or shatter. It focused all that kinetic energy into a point the size of a coin, generating pressures so intense that the steel of the tank armor behaved like a fluid. It punched through like a finger through wet clay. The friction generated heat of over 3,000 degrees Celsius in a fraction of a second, sending a spray of white-hot molten shrapnel, spall, into the fighting compartment. It didn't need explosive filler. The armor itself became the shrapnel. Inside the Tiger, the crew wouldn't hear the bang before they were dead. The projectile moved faster than the sound of the gun firing. It was a horrifying innovation, a triumph of material science over brute force. The development of this round had been a saga of failures and breakthroughs. Concept work began in 1941, born of the desperation to counter the new German heavy tanks. Early tests were disastrous, with sabots failing to separate cleanly, sending the projectile tumbling wildly, missing targets by hundreds of yards. There were accusations of wasted funds, skepticism from the brass who believed in the reliability of the older, heavier rounds. But a breakthrough in the sabot design, using a pot shape that caught the wind like a parachute to peel away, changed everything. By the time the first crates of APDS reached the front lines in Italy, in early 1944, they were treated like gold dust, handed out sparingly, only to the best crews. Williams' crew had received 5 rounds. Just 5. They were told to save them for the big cats. And now, in the pre-dawn dark of the Liry Valley, the big cat was prowling. The radar of the battlefield was the ears of the men and the intuition of the veterans. They heard it before they saw it, the low, grinding rumble of Maybach engines, the squeal of wide tracks on gravel. A Tiger was moving into a hull-down position behind a stone farmhouse, 800 yards away. William pressed his eye to the telescopic sight, the cold rubber ring digging into his socket. His hands stopped trembling. The world narrowed down to the crosshairs and the shadowy bulk of the farmhouse. He whispered the range to his loader. "Sabot up!" the loader hissed back, the heavy metallic clank of the breech block slamming shut echoing like a gavel. This wasn't just a shot. It was an experiment in impossible physics. The German commander in that Tiger, likely a veteran of the Eastern Front, felt secure. He knew the range. He knew the capabilities of the 17-pounder with standard ammo. He knew he was safe. He was wrong. At 0415, Williams squeezed the firing lever. The gun roared, a flash that momentarily turned the valley into noon, the violent recoil digging the spades deep into the Italian soil. The sabot flew. The physics took over. In less than 2/3 of a second, the tungsten dart crossed the 800 yards. It struck the Tiger's thick frontal glacis plate. It didn't bounce, it didn't shatter. It erased the German assumption of invincibility in a flash of white heat. The impossible had just happened. To understand why that specific shot in the Liry Valley represented such a seismic shock to the Wehrmacht, you cannot just look at the ballistics. You have to dissect the soul of the German war machine and go back to the moment arrogance became official doctrine, solidified in 1942, when the first Tigers rolled off the Henschel assembly lines with the implicit promise that technical superiority could annul numerical reality. The military philosophy that placed that tank in Sergeant Mitchell's path was not merely tactical, it was theological, based on the concept of Qualitätsüberlegenheit, the fanatical belief that a single superlative weapon system, operated by an elite crew, was worth 10, 20, or 50 inferior enemy systems, a calculated gamble that made rational sense in the corridors of Berlin, but ignored the entropic brutality of the battlefield. German commanders, men like Colonel von Rosen or General Guderian, had internalized the lesson that armor was time and time was life, building a doctrine where the Tiger was not just a vehicle, but the focal point, the mobile Schwerpunkt, around which the battle was to revolve, assuming the enemy would always be forced to close the distance to engage, voluntarily entering the kill zone dictated by the microscopically precise Zeiss optics and the 88mm KWK-36 gun. They trusted specifications that seemed like immutable laws of physics: 100mm of face-hardened frontal homogeneous steel, 80mm on the sides, a combat weight of 57 tons that crushed bridges and demanded a logistical nightmare, but offered the crew inside that steel box the most dangerous illusion of all in war, the illusion of invulnerability. This confidence was not unfounded. It was validated in blood in previous engagements that the Tiger crew in the Leary knew by heart, like the legendary engagement at Villers-Bocage or the killing fields of Kursk the previous summer, where combat reports routinely cited Tigers returning to base with marks of 20, 30, even 50 Allied 75mm shell impacts that merely scratched the Dunkelgelb paint, leaving the crew inside dazed by the concussion, but alive, breathing, and convinced they were gods in an indestructible chariot. Intercepted documents and prisoner interrogations revealed absolute faith. The Tommy has to get to 500 meters to scratch my varnish, and I can kill him at 2,000, a phrase repeated in infinite variations in letters home and field diaries, creating a culture of tactical complacency where caution was seen as unnecessary. This wasn't ignorance. German intelligence, the Fremde Heer West, knew exactly what the Allies had. They possessed detailed reports on the 17-pounder, knew its caliber, knew the muzzle velocity of its standard rounds, and had mathematically calculated that using conventional armor-piercing ammunition, the APCBC, the Canadian gun would have marginal difficulties penetrating the Tiger's frontal glacis at 800 yards if the angle wasn't perfect. What they failed to grasp, what they couldn't internalize until that morning of May 24th, was that the Allies had stopped playing the brute force game and changed the fundamental rules of armor penetration, swapping mass for extreme velocity, a catastrophic epistemological failure born of the inability to imagine the enemy could solve the problem of the impossible physics of stabilizing a sub-caliber tungsten dart flying at 4,000 feet per second. They prepared for a heavyweight boxing match, reinforcing the chin and training to absorb punches, without realizing the enemy had brought a surgical stiletto capable of slipping between the ribs and piercing the heart before the brain registered the pain. Tons of steel, millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of hours of specialized training in armor angling maneuvers, all wasted in that moment because it was designed to stop a type of threat Sergeant Mitchell was no longer firing. The tragic irony, which would only become clear in the autopsies of the destroyed vehicles and in after-action reports written with shaking hands by survivors, was that the very thickness of the Tiger's armor, that wall of steel that gave them such security, actually contributed to the lethality of the new projectile, providing more material to be converted into superheated shrapnel when the physics of the APDS took over, turning protection into danger, shield into grenade. But before we talk about the physics of tungsten tearing through steel, we need to talk about the man who pulled the firing lanyard, because technology is inert without human will, and William James Mitchell was not born to destroy tanks. He was forged for it by the circumstances of a broken decade. Born on November 12, 1912 in Hamilton, Ontario, a city defined by the silhouette of industrial smokestacks and the perpetual orange glow of blast furnaces that lit the night like a sickly false dawn, William grew up breathing soot and sulfur, the son of Thomas Mitchell, a foreman at the Steel Company of Canada who lost 3 fingers on his left hand in a hydraulic press, and Sarah, a woman who sewed until her eyes went milky with cataracts to put food on the table during the worst years of the Depression. Before the war, William was not a warrior. He was a third-class machinist at the same plant that maimed his father, earning 18 cents an hour to monitor the temper of metal alloys, learning intimately how steel behaved under heat and pressure, a tactile knowledge that, ironically, would make him a more efficient tank killer years later. He had dreams, silent aspirations he kept in sketchbooks hidden under his mattress, sketches of bridges and architectural structures, clean, logical lines seeking order in the dirty chaos of his industrial existence. But the war interrupted that pursuit of beauty with the brutality of a hammer. He didn't enlist for abstract patriotism or newsreel glory. He volunteered in September 39, days after the invasion of Poland, driven by a mix of stoic duty and the economic need to escape Hamilton's cycle of poverty. But his mother's reaction, captured in a letter he kept folded in his tunic pocket until it disintegrated in the Italian mud, was of prophetic terror. "They will give you a gun, Will, but they will take your soul in return." His basic training at Petawawa was a blur of cold, calluses, and the calculated humiliation designed to break civilians and reassemble them as instruments of obedience. But it was in the specialized anti-tank role that he found his place, not because he liked it, but because his mind, trained on the microscopic tolerances of the mill, instinctively understood the geometry of direct fire, the relationship between distance, velocity, and time of flight. He vividly remembered his instructor, Sergeant Major Blackjack McIntyre, a sadistic Scot who screamed that an anti-tank gunner had a life expectancy of 12 seconds after the first shot if he missed, a statistic William repeated to himself like a mantra in every ambush position from Sicily to Ortona. His first experience under live fire wasn't heroic, it was visceral and humiliating, shitting his pants while German mortars turned an olive grove into a moonscape in Sicily, the smell of turned earth and fresh blood etching itself into his cortex forever. But it was there, watching his original loader, a 19-year-old kid named Dougie, have his chest opened by shrapnel, that cold competence replaced fear. He went from a scared civilian to a lethal operator in a matter of months, learning to suppress humanity to do the necessary math, treating death not as a tragedy, but as a ballistic solution. Yet the moral dilemma never completely disappeared. It was just buried under layers of cynical rationalization and combat fatigue. William knew with the terrible clarity of sleepless dawns that on the other end of those telescopic sights were not faceless monsters, but men, perhaps former mill workers from the Ruhr or farmers from Bavaria, men who wrote to their mothers and were afraid of the dark, and his specific function was to incinerate them alive inside iron coffins. He recalls a conversation in a bombed-out cellar in Campobasso with his ammo handler, Corporal Elias, where he tried to justify the horror. "It's metal on metal, Elias. It's not like sticking a bayonet in someone," a lie both accepted while sipping sour wine, but one that didn't hold up against the reality of the screams they heard when a tank brewed up after a direct hit. He rationalized that every destroyed Tiger saved a platoon of Canadian infantry, that every silenced 88 allowed more boys from Saskatoon and Winnipeg to go home, but the psychological cost of this utilitarian math was a weight that bowed his shoulders more than the 17-pound shells he hauled. In his diary, found decades later in a shoebox by a great-nephew, an entry dated 2 weeks before the Liri Valley summed up the fracture in his psyche. "Today, we killed a Panzer IV. Saw a crewman bail out of the burning hatch. He ran 10 meters and collapsed. I felt nothing. I'm afraid that when this is over, I will never be able to feel anything for anyone again." This was the human baggage, the sediment of trauma and guilt, that Sergeant William James Mitchell brought to the breech of his gun that May morning, a man who had learned to shut off his empathy to survive, about to use a weapon that didn't just require aim, but blind faith in a new form of destruction. And that technical innovation, the tool that would allow his shaking hand to destroy the masterpiece of German engineering, was officially designated as Armor-Piercing Discarding Sabot, or APDS, but to the men on the front line, it was simply the Dart. For the Ordnance Board engineers in London, it was a marvel of applied ballistic science. For William, it was the difference between life and death, an object that seemed too small to do the job, almost fragile compared to the brutal solid shot they were used to. The concept of APDS was a visceral revolution. Instead of firing a steel projectile the full diameter of the barrel, which lost velocity quickly due to air drag, the new design used a dense, thin tungsten carbide core, a metal so hard it was used to machine industrial steel, encased in a lightweight alloy sabot or casing that fell away upon exiting the barrel. The technical specification was terrifying in its lethal simplicity. The tungsten core measured just 38 millimeters in diameter, but left the muzzle at a staggering 3,950 feet per second, or 1,204 meters per second. a hypersonic velocity that made the air crack like God's whip. To put this in visceral perspective, imagine a knitting needle made of the hardest material on Earth being launched at 4 times the speed of sound. There was no explosive inside it, no complex fuse, just pure kinetic energy, mass times velocity squared, concentrated on a point the size of a coin. When this dart hit the armor, it didn't push the steel aside like conventional shells. It moved so fast that the armor steel didn't have time to react as a solid, behaving plastically, flowing like warm wax under the pressure of a hot finger, or like butter under a knife heated to 200 degrees Celsius. The friction generated at the moment of impact was so intense, it created a flash of light visible for miles and raised the local temperature to thousands of degrees in microseconds, causing fragments of the tank's own armor and the projectile to vaporize and be injected into the crew compartment like a spray of liquid, incandescent metal aerosol. It wasn't necessary to penetrate and explode. The penetration was the explosion. If the projectile hit ammunition or fuel, ignition was instantaneous, but even if it didn't, the shockwave and spray of spall, internal shrapnel, turned the tank's interior into an instant blast furnace, shredding flesh and bone with the indifference of an industrial grinder. The development of this ammunition was not a straight line of success. It was a chronicle of agonizing failures and near cancellations, starting in 1941 in secret labs in the UK, where scientists like Dr. Permutter battled the inherent instability of the design. Early tests were catastrophic, with sabots failing to separate cleanly, sending projectiles tumbling wildly off target, dangerous to anyone in the same zip code except the enemy tank. There were biting criticisms from traditionalist generals who viewed it as a scientific toy, unworthy of battlefield brutality, demanding focus on producing more conventional steel and gunpowder, arguments that nearly killed the project in the cradle for lack of funds and institutional faith. The major breakthrough came only in late '43, when a change in sabot geometry allowed air resistance to peel it away cleanly and symmetrically milliseconds after leaving the barrel, releasing the deadly core for its flat, merciless trajectory. The first successful test, conducted in secrecy at Shoeburyness, saw the new projectile pierce a 130mm armor plate angled at 30 degrees at a distance of 1,000 yards, a feat that silenced observers and made the officer in charge turn pale, realizing what it meant, the end of the era of passive armor. But production was slow, tungsten was scarce and strategically vital, rationed like diamond dust, meaning that when the first crates reached Italy in the spring of '44, they were treated with almost religious reverence. William's crew received just 5 of these rounds, 5 chances to achieve the impossible, packed in waxed cardboard tubes that seemed too mundane to contain the end of a myth. The system's operation that dawn would be a dance of mechanical precision and human instinct. First, visual or auditory detection, the gunner cranking the elevation and traverse wheels, fighting friction and the gun's weight to align the optics. The round would be loaded, the breech block slamming shut with that definitive sound of machined steel, isolating the propellant charge from the outside world. When the firing pin struck the primer, the cordite deflagration would generate 40,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, pushing the assembly down the rifled barrel. Upon exit, the sabot petals would open and fly sideways like dead leaves in a gale, dangerous to friendly infantry near the muzzle, while the dart, now free and accelerating, would cross the 800 meters of valley in less than 0.7 seconds. This wasn't the old method of guesswork artillery, observing fall of shot and adjusting. With this speed, the trajectory was so flat, gravity barely had time to act on the projectile, making the concept of super elevation for range almost obsolete at these combat ranges. It was point and click, turning complex ballistics into an act of pointing the finger of death. And there he was, William James Mitchell, a man who wanted to build houses, now holding the fate of 5 German men on the tip of a rare metal dart, waiting in the darkness, while the sound of the Tiger's Maybach HL-230 engine grew like approaching thunder, oblivious to the fact that the physics protecting its crew were about to be revoked. The technological disparity that defined the confrontation in the Leary Valley was hidden within the casing of a projectile that looked deceptively harmless, a cylinder of aluminum alloy protecting a core of tungsten no wider than a broom handle. But to understand the violence it was about to unleash, one must understand the mechanical intimacy of the 17-pounder gun itself. This weapon was not elegant. It was a brute of industrial purpose, weighing 3 tons with a barrel length of 55 calibers that made it awkward to tow and a nightmare to camouflage, a distinct silhouette that German spotters were trained to identify and prioritize above all others because they knew it was the only thing on the battlefield that could hurt them. When the gun fired, the violence was not just directed at the enemy. The muzzle brake, a heavy steel device screwed onto the end of the barrel, diverted the propellant gases sideways and backwards to counteract the recoil, creating a zone of overpressure on either side of the gun that could rupture eardrums and cause internal bleeding to anyone standing in the wrong spot. For the crew, firing the 17-pounder was a physical assault, a concussion that rattled the teeth in their sockets and filled their sinuses with the acrid taste of burnt ammonia. The breech mechanism alone was a masterpiece of lethal engineering, a massive block of steel sliding vertically in grooves machined to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch, capable of sealing the chamber against pressures that would turn lesser metals into liquid. When William ran his hand over the cold steel of the breech that morning, he wasn't just touching a machine, he was touching the culmination of a desperate arms race, the British answer to the German 88, forged in the panic of 1942 when the Tiger first appeared in Tunisia and shattered Allied morale. The specific round loaded into the chamber, the APDS Mark I, was a finicky beast. Unlike standard solid shot, which was a simple slug of steel, the discarding sabot was a complex assembly of 3 parts: the tungsten core, the light alloy sheath, and a driving band that engaged the rifling. If any part of this assembly was imperfect, if the sabot separated asymmetrically by even a fraction of a second, the projectile would wobble, losing accuracy and tumbling harmlessly into the dirt. The crew knew the horror stories from the testing grounds, rumors of sabots disintegrating inside the barrel or flying off at wild angles to kill friendly troops. But on this morning, the fear of malfunction was eclipsed by the terror of the Tiger. The engagement began not with a visual sighting, but with a sound that every veteran in Italy recognized in their marrow: the metallic clatter of tracks on rock, distinct from the Sherman's rubber-padded tracks, a heavy, rhythmic grinding that signaled 60 tons of problem. The mist in the valley was shifting, tearing apart in ragged patches to reveal the stone farmhouse 800 yards away, and there, emerging from the shadows like a leviathan surfacing, was the angular, boxy shape of the Tiger Wine, its long 88mm gun traversing slowly, scanning the Canadian lines like the eye of a predator. It was a late production model, identified by the steel-rimmed road wheels and the Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste coating its vertical surfaces, a texture like waffle batter hardened into concrete designed to defeat magnetic mines, giving the tank a rough, reptilian skin. William's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but his hands moved with practiced robotic calm, adjusting the elevation wheel, bringing the horizontal crosshair to rest on the center mass of the German tank. The range was 800 yards. In the old world, the world of standard ammunition, this was a gamble. The shell would drop several feet over that distance, requiring precise estimation. In the new world of APDS, the trajectory was effectively a laser beam. "On target," he whispered, his voice sounding strange and distant in his own ears. The loader, a replacement named Corporal Jenkins, who was shaking so hard the shell rattled against the breech ring, shoved the round home. Clang. The sound of the breech closing was the punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had begun in 1939. "Fire," William said, not shouted, just a simple exhalation of breath. He squeezed the lever. The world disintegrated. The sensation of firing a 17-pounder with APDS is unlike anything else. The report is sharper, a high-pitched crack that splits the sky, followed instantly by the physical shove of the recoil that digs the trail spades 6 inches deeper into the earth. The muzzle flash was blinding, a sphere of white fire that momentarily illuminated every pebble in the trench, but William kept his eye glued to the sight, blinking through the afterimage. He didn't see the sabot separate. That happened too fast for the human eye, a cloud of aluminum petals discarding 20 yards from the muzzle. He only saw the result. The time of flight was 0.6 seconds. The German commander in the Tiger never heard the shot. The tungsten dart struck the vertical plate of the driver's visualization port, the thickest part of the frontal armor, a place where no Allied shell had any business penetrating. There was no explosion on the outside, no Hollywood fireball, just a spark, a violently bright flash of kinetic energy conversion as the tungsten met the steel. And then, the hole. A neat, dark puncture, surrounded by a glowing ring of molten metal. The dart didn't stop. It passed through the 100 millimeters of face-hardened steel as if it were wet cardboard, retaining enough energy to cross the fighting compartment and punch through the engine firewall at the rear. But the damage wasn't just the hole. It was what happened to the armor itself. As the dart forced its way through, it displaced the steel of the Tiger's hull, atomizing it, creating a cone of spall, hundreds of fragments of superheated, jagged metal that sprayed into the crew compartment at the speed of a shotgun blast. Inside the Tiger, the physics of the event translated into biological horror. The driver, Gefreiter Hans Müller, 22 years old from Dusseldorf, was killed instantly, not by the dart itself, but by the spall that vaporized his upper torso. The radio operator next to him didn't even have time to scream before the overpressure wave liquefied his internal organs. In the turret, the commander, loading officer, and gunner were bathed in a spray of molten steel droplets that ignited their uniforms and seared their skin instantly. The atmosphere inside the tank, a mix of oil vapor, cordite residue, and human breath, ignited. The pressure spike blew the hatches open with a sound like a giant popping a cork. Smoke, thick and oily, began to pour from the turret ring. It was a kill, a catastrophic instant kill. For a second there was silence in the valley, a stunned hiatus, as the reality of what had just happened settled over the battlefield. The invincible Tiger, the monster that required air support or a flanking maneuver by half a squadron to defeat, had been gutted from the front at nearly half a mile by a single shot. William took his eye away from the sight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the smoking breech of his gun, then back at the burning hulk across the valley. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel the elation of victory. He felt a cold, profound awe at the terrible efficiency of what they had just done. They hadn't just destroyed a tank. They had rendered an entire philosophy of war obsolete. The German belief in heavy armor, the doctrine of the invulnerable fortress, had died in that fraction of a second, pierced by a needle of tungsten. The irony was palpable. The Germans had built a dinosaur, and the Canadians had just invented the asteroid. The rest of the engagement was a blur of mechanical action, adjusting, firing again, confirming the kill, but the significance of that first shot would ripple out far beyond the Liri Valley. It was the moment the balance of power shifted, not because of numbers, but because physics had finally caught up with ambition. In the aftermath, as the sun finally broke over the mountains, illuminating the pillar of black smoke rising from the Tiger, William sat on an ammo crate, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. He looked at his hands, covered in grease and soot, the hands of a builder, now the hands of a destroyer who had mastered the art of the impossible. He thought of his father in the steel mill, manipulating metal to build. He had just manipulated metal to unmake. The impossible physics had worked, but as he watched the flames consume the steel coffin he had created, he wondered if the cost of such knowledge was something that could ever be paid in full. The smoke rising from the shattered Tiger in the Liri Valley was more than just the combustion of diesel and rubber. It was the funeral pyre of an era, the physical manifestation of a paradigm shift that would echo through military academies and engineering boards for decades to come. As the adrenaline of the kill faded, replaced by the hollow exhaustion that always follows combat, Sergeant William James Mitchell and his crew walked cautiously toward the wreckage later that day, after the sector had been secured by the infantry of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. The approach to a kill was a ritual, a morbid curiosity to see the handiwork of their ballistics up close, to validate the impossible. What they found was a testament to the terrifying intimacy of the new warfare. The entry hole in the Tiger's frontal plate was small, almost disappointingly so, a pockmark barely larger than a thumb, surrounded by a splash of silver metal where the heat of impact had boiled the steel. It looked innocuous, surgical, unlike the brutal gouges left by high-explosive rounds, but the back of the tank told the real story. The engine deck had been blown upwards, the heavy iron grates twisted like licorice, evidence of the catastrophic overpressure that had built up inside. They didn't look inside the hatches. The smell of roasted meat and burnt transmission fluid was barrier enough, a sensory warning that what lay within was no longer recognizable as human. William stood there, running his hand over the zimmerit coating of the hull, feeling the rough texture, realizing the futility of it all. The Germans had spent countless hours applying this paste to stop magnetic mines, a threat that barely materialized, while the real threat, a dart moving at Mach 4, had rendered all their preparation meaningless. It was the ultimate irony of the arms race, the perfect defense against the wrong weapon. He picked up a fragment of the sabot from the grass, a twisted piece of aluminum alloy, light as a feather, and turned it over in his palm. This piece of junk metal had delivered the death blow to 60 tons of Krupp steel. He put it in his pocket, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the fragility of power. In the weeks that followed, reports of similar kills began to trickle in from across the front. Sherman Fireflies and towed 17-pounders, punching through Panthers and Tigers at ranges that made German crews question their sanity. The psychological impact was immediate. German tankers, once aggressive and confident, became tentative, refusing to engage in open duels, retreating at the first sign of the distinctive muzzle flash of the 17-pounder. The Tiger phobia that had paralyzed Allied troops was beginning to reverse. Now the hunters were becoming the hunted, looking nervously at every hedgerow, knowing that distance was no longer a shield. But for William, the victory was hollow. The war didn't end that morning in the valley. It ground on through the Gothic line, through the mud of autumn and the snow of another winter, consuming more men, more steel, more of his soul. He survived the war, physically intact, but internally rearranged, carrying the silence of the Liry Valley with him back to Hamilton. He never went back to the steel mill. The smell of hot metal was too close to the smell of the burning Tiger. Instead, he became a carpenter, working with wood, a material that was warm, organic, forgiving, something that didn't scream when you cut it. He married, had 2 daughters, lived a quiet life in a suburban bungalow, burying his medals in a box in the basement, along with that piece of twisted aluminum. He rarely spoke of the war, and never of the physics of the tungsten dart. It wasn't until the 1980s, when a historian interviewing Canadian veterans for a documentary tracked him down, that he finally told the story. The interview, recorded on grainy VHS tape, shows an old man with thin white hair and hands that still tremble slightly, sitting in a plaid armchair. When asked about the impossible shot, he doesn't smile. He looks past the camera, his eyes focusing on a point 800 yards away in the distance of his memory. "It wasn't impossible," he says, his voice rasping with age. "It was just physics. The math didn't care about their propaganda. The math didn't care about their ideology. The math just solved the equation." He pauses, his fingers tracing the pattern on the armrest. "We broke their tanks, but I think the physics broke us a little bit too. You can't wield that kind of power, that kind of indifference to life, without it taking a piece of you." The documentary ends with a shot of the Tiger's wreckage, still rusting in an Italian field, overgrown with wildflowers, a monument to the futility of invincibility. The hole in the front armor is now a home for lizards and spiders. The tungsten dart is long gone, disintegrated or buried deep in the Italian soil, but the legacy of that morning remains. It was the dawn of the kinetic energy penetrator, the precursor to the modern Sabot rounds used by Abrams and Leopard tanks today, the great-grandfather of the depleted uranium darts that would tear through Iraqi armor in the Gulf War 50 years later. But for William James Mitchell, it was just the day the world got smaller, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. The video fades to black, leaving only the sound of the wind whistling through the Liry Valley, a sound that, if you listen closely, sounds like a gasp of surprise from a ghost who thought he was immortal. The screen stays dark for a moment, holding the weight of the silence before the credits roll, listing the names of the men who fired the guns and the men who died in the tanks, united finally in the democracy of the past, reduced to names on a screen, while the physics of war marches on, indifferent, efficient, and eternal.